From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
My name is Anya Kreitney, and I'm the Program Specialist of the Poetry and Literature Center at the Library of Congress. And before we begin today, I want to first say a couple of things about our offices and the series that gathers us here today. The Poetry and Literature Center at the Library of Congress is home to the Poet Laureate Consultant in Poetry, and we put on 30 to 40 public programs just like this one per year. To find out more about the current Poet Laureate, Juan Felipe Herrera, or the program offerings, please be sure to visit us at www.loc.gov/poetry. Let me also tell you a little bit about the Bagley Wright Lecture Series on poetry. The series seeks to provide leading poets with an opportunity to explore in depth a subject of their choosing within the field of poetry and poetics. Through financial and logistical support, Bagley Wright recipients then give lectures resulting from these investigations. And the hope is that this series provides lasting works of criticism that aid not only current practitioners, but scholars and general readers as well. It is for this reason that we're so excited to hear poet and memoirist Rachel Zucker's lecture titled The Poetics of Wrongness, an Unapologia, as you see here. Ms. Zucker, aside from teaching at NYU, is the author of 9 books, most recently The Pedestrians, and a double collection of prose and poetry titled Mothers, both of which are for sale in the back, and I'm sure you all can buy a copy, and Rachel would love to sign. And the last thing I'll do is just remind everyone to turn off your cell phones or any other devices that will interfere with the event. And please note that there will be a Q&A at the end of the lecture, and anyone who asks a question gives us permission to use your question in the recording. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Rachel. Rachel?
Thank you so much, Anya. It's really a pleasure, a privilege, and a terror to be here. I really want to thank the Bagley Wright Lecture Series, especially Matthew Zapruder, Charlie Wright, and Ellen Welker, and also to tell you that this is my first in this series of lectures, and I'm having a slight tech issue, so hopefully it won't be a problem, but please bear with me. The Poetics of Wrongness. Don't get too close to the mic. I am writing this lecture in the middle of a particular night in my particular life. This is relevant. 3 years ago, I was asked to write these lectures, and it seemed impossible. I'd never given lectures. I imagined that giving a lecture required me to tell other people what I think, what I know, and that's not really my style. Or maybe giving a lecture required me to tell people what they should think, and that's really not my style. What is my style, you wonder? I'm getting to it. Stay with me, stay in the present, this moment for a moment. I am, at this particular time in my particular life, at the time of this writing, the mother of 3 sons, 16, 14, and 8. This is relevant. What you need to know about this experience is that I am always wrong. I have learned from my 14-year-old that I am always not listening, even when I think I am listening. I am not helping, even when I'm trying to help. I don't get it, even when I'm trying to understand. My body is wrong, my presence is wrong. The only thing more wrong is my absence. When I am present, it is embarrassing. When I am absent, it is wounding. Weren't you ever embarrassed by your parents, he asks me, when he doesn't want me to meet him after the movie he's going to with his friends? Yes, I say. I was embarrassed by my mother every moment of every day and night when I was your age, I do not say. But it is news to me, unpleasant news, that I am now that mother, that embarrassing mother, although the fact that this is news is probably proof that I wasn't listening, I don't get it, and everything about me is wrong. My 16-year-old doesn't find me personally embarrassing or flawed. From him, I discover that I am rather universally flawed, mistaken, and existentially irredeemable. My wrongness is part of the human condition. I am just one not very interesting specimen of general disappointment. With surprising patience, a raised eyebrow, and frequent deep sighing, he explains the many ways in which my ideas about gender, race, mathematics, science, economics, politics, history, psychology, and countless other topics are outdated, erroneous, and reprehensible. My just-turned 8-year-old vaulted from his toddler phase, in which everything everyone said or did was indisputably wrong if it conflicted with what he wanted, directly into his Woody Allen phase, in which he daily confronts me with questions like, "Can you tell me one thing that matters after the world ends? No, nothing, see? So then nothing matters, right?" Or, "If everyone dies, then why does being a good person while you're alive matter? Because eventually you're going to die and everyone you ever helped will die, so..." There are no right answers to these questions, and this makes me both wrong and profoundly disappointing. Also, I am specifically wrong about everything having to do with soccer, football, music, the appropriate volume of music, the purpose of school, that there is a purpose, whether so-and-so is a nice person or not, what is funny, what is not funny, what is too rough or dangerous, and the matter of playing ball in the apartment. In other words, everything important. Well, you might be thinking, being a parent is like that. But it's not just my kids. This is the summer, 18 years into my marriage, that everything I say hurts my husband, and everything he says hurts me. We misunderstand each other. Our words come out wrong or are taken wrong. Our tone is wrong, even if the words don't wound. And if we stop talking, we descend into a terrifying hopelessness. Stay with me. This is relevant. 2 days ago, it was gently revealed to me that the 3 lectures I'd spent 7 months researching and writing are too long, about too many things, simultaneously unfounded and overly informational, too personal, too impersonal, basically failures. Perhaps with work, these drafts could become essays, but they are not lectures, said my editor. So, to summarize, my math is wrong, my logic is wrong, my presence is wrong, my absence is wrong, my gender is wrong, insofar as I come from a mode of thinking in which I believe that gender is a real thing, rather than a fluid social construct infinitely complicated and slippery. Being male would make me more wrong, but being female is also wrong, and conflating race with gender and sexual preference is wrong. My heterosexuality and whiteness make me wrong always and all the time, in the sense that they confer unto me privileges at great cost to others, so that any rightness I have in the sense of power or agency is wrongly mine and part of what makes me wrong in the world, and certainly part of what makes the world very wrong. At 43, I am too old and too young. Old people look at me wistfully, teenagers with disgust, and children with distrust. Also, the whole world hates Americans, even if they want to be one. Clearly, I am in the Hillary Clinton stage of my life. Everything about me makes someone extremely angry. Who does she think she is? Who do I think I am? And what does this have to do with poetry? In this climate of wrongness, it is difficult to say anything. This isn't new. It's just more apparent to me than ever before. The volume of my wrongness is turned up so high it's impossible to ignore and difficult to shout over. To say anything, even to say I'm wrong, is wrong. White people should listen. But to be silent or meek or apologetic is also wrong, because women should be strong and assertive. And speaking of climate, I am one of everyone who is irreparably destroying the environment, and so I am more wrong than my children even can imagine. What woke me up this night, in the middle of this night, was the realization that all this wrongness is excruciating and is somehow exactly right and what I need to talk about. These last 7 months writing about photography, confessional poetry, and the ethical considerations of writing about real people, I was trying to build a case for my thinking and convince you that my ideas were right and interesting and worth your time. And in this way, I'd abandoned what made me a poet and the very nature of my poetics. I first started writing and still write poetry because the world and its people and ideas are wrong, insane, immoral, disappointing, and unimaginably terrible. I write because I feel wrong, sad, crazy, disappointed, disappointing, and unimaginably terrible. I write to expose wrongness and confess wrongness, and with a sense that doing so is futile at best and more likely part of wrongness and compounds wrongness. I write against. Mine is a poetics of opposition and provocation that I never outgrew. Against wrongness and out of wrongness and with wrongness. So here's my current definition of a poet. I am wrong, and you are wrong, and I'm willing to say it, therefore I'm a poet. A poet is a person who feels wrong in a wrong world and is willing to speak even when doing so proves her own wrongness, ugliness, brokenness, and complicity. This is not the same as saying that I write poetry to feel better or to be forgiven, or that the goal of poetry is to right wrongs. Perhaps some people feel better when they write poetry. Perhaps some poems make the world less wrong. But what I'm trying to explain here is that the athleticism of poetry is the poet's ability to stay in and with wrongness, of being willing to be disliked for being too smart and too stupid, too direct and incomprehensible, elitist and the lowest of the low, and all for what? For the privilege of pointing out that everything in the world is wrong. Wrongness is intrinsic to poetry, which asserts with its most defining formal device, the line break, that the margins of prose are wrong, or, with its attention to diction, that the ways in which we've come to understand and use words are wrong. Maybe you think I'm wrong in the way I'm using the word wrong. Fine, I embrace it. I've never written to please you, even if I liked it when you were pleased. I write to talk back, sometimes to myself, not to tell you what I think, but to figure out what I think, which is always a process of proving myself and others wrong. It is the job of poems to undermine, refute, retort, re-see, and disrupt, to tell you nicely or aggressively that you are wrong, the world is fucked up, and all our modes of understanding and expression are suspect, that there is nothing and no one above reproach or scrutiny. Poets speak even when it is excruciating, even when no one is listening, even when the poet would be better off staying silent. That's what a poem is, the breaking of silence, a form that makes and then breaks silence over and over. Poetry is the language of pain and grief and hurt and love, and most people in our country hate it, but often need it and sometimes find solace or pleasure in it. I've learned from being a daughter and a mother that finding your parent wrong or being told how wrong you are is a complicated act of attention, separation, individuation, and love. A parasitic sort of love, perhaps, but love, in that it's a way of paying attention, of giving a shit. The alternative to being wrong is being ignored. So here are 6 assertions of poetry, offered in the mode of opposition, without apology, with complete certainty that you, audience, along with my sons, my friends, my students, the culture, the subculture, the past, the future, strangers and intimates, both living and dead, are sure to consider what follows wrong. Enjoy being in good company. Enjoy the brief pleasure of feeling that I am more wrong than you are. Believe me, you are wrong too. 6 anti-tenets of the Poetics of Wrongness. 1, poetry should be beautiful. John Keats is wrong, or the Grecian urn is wrong when it says, Beauty is truth, truth beauty. That is all ye know on earth and all ye need to know. No. First of all, to the extent that I even understand what beauty is, I distrust it and reject it as a quality poetry should pursue or attempt to embody. Beauty is not an inherent quality, but is rather the manipulation of a thing, a bettering, an idealizing of the ordinary and the real. By this logic, then, beauty is not truth, but closer to anti-truth. My definition of beauty may be ahistorical. My beauty, a quality primarily invoked to make me buy something I don't need or believe, something that isn't true, an industry sold primarily to women to make them make themselves look different than they would naturally look, this might not be Keats's beauty, just as I'm pretty sure my idea of truth is not quite the same as his. Perhaps Keats or the urn was referring to a beauty akin to the Greek notion of perfection, a just right proportion that already exists, that waits to be identified rather than made, in which the circle might be a perfect shape, or painting the perfect art. It's this kind of thinking that underlies Samuel Coleridge's famous delineation of prose and poetry. I wish our clever young poets would remember my homely definitions of prose and poetry. That is, prose is words in their best order, poetry, the best words in the best order. Best, perfect, beautiful. I have just as much trouble with perfection or bestness as I do with beauty, which is a bettering. Perfection and beauty imply flawlessness, and flawlessness is an untruth. Perhaps that's why the poem To Dorothy by Marvin Bell moves me. To Dorothy. You are not beautiful exactly. You are beautiful inexactly. You let a weed grow by the mulberry and a mulberry grow by the house. So close in the personal quiet of a windy night, it brushes the wall and sweeps away the day till we sleep. A child said it and it seemed true. Things that are lost are all equal, but it isn't true. If I lost you, the air wouldn't move, nor the tree grow. Someone would pull the weed, my flower. The quiet wouldn't be yours. If I lost you, I'd have to ask the grass to let me sleep. The Poetics of Wrongness rejects flawlessness. Even the perfect metaphor breaks down in this poem. The Poetics of Wrongness is only interested in perfection as a manifestation of the Greek notion of teleos, or completeness, because completeness contains everything, including the wrongness of things, the flaws, the weeds, the inexact beauty of Dorothy, and the poet's desire to write about his love for Dorothy, which is a necessary and necessarily failed and inexact endeavor. 2, poetry should be slant. Speaking of truth, here's another famous poet I'd like to contradict. Tell all the truth, but tell it slant, Emily Dickinson wrote, and she was wrong. Actually, the people who interpreted her directive to mean that poets should intentionally try to make the truth more complicated than it is, they are wrong. I prefer to read Dickinson's short poem as a wittier, quieter, but no less powerful version of Jack Nicholson in A Few Good Men shouting, "You can't handle the truth." Tell all the truth, but tell it slant. Success in circuit lies, too bright for our infirm delight, the truth's superb surprise. As lightning to the children eased, with explanation kind, the truth must dazzle gradually, or every man be blind. Dickinson's not saying don't tell all the truth. She's not even saying don't tell it all at once. She's saying that the truth, unmediated and given directly, will make men blind. I read Dickinson's use of the word success as containing a heavy dose of proto-irony. And now I have, thank you, sorry, we're going back. Somehow, though, in the line, "Tell all the truth but tell it slant," the word slant has been taken to mean that it is the poet's job to dole out truth in small doses or show the world in flashes or dimly illuminated because telling a slant truth is kinder, less blinding, or because the slant truth is more interesting. This kind of thinking has been used to bolster a poetics of coyness and indirection, which often slips into glibness, abstraction, and meaninglessness. It's hard enough to know if there is such a thing as truth. Don't waste your time trying to make it less clear or sit there in the dark waiting for lightning to make things momentarily visible. Be as clear as you can possibly be, always. Blind me. I dare you. The Poetics of Wrongness responds to slantness in Whitman's voice and with his words. Now I wash the gum from your eyes. You must habit yourself to the dazzle of the light and of every moment of your life. 3, a poem should be short. Wrong. A poem should be as long as it needs to be. The poems I love often brush up against the rules of the form, then run roughshod over those rules, then turn around and spit in the face of those rules. It's not that a short poem is necessarily impossible, but I reject absolutely the notion that what makes a poem is that it contains language that is best or better, see number 1, is a thing of beauty made with language, number 1, is difficult, tricky, altered truth for the sake of inventiveness or kindness, see number 2, or that what distinguishes poetry from other forms of language is brevity, concision, not an extra word in sight. Here's a tiny, lovely poem by W.S. Merwin. Separation. Your absence has gone through me like thread through a needle. Everything I do is stitched with its color. Here's another short poem, this one by Margaret Atwood, no less sweet, but also powerful. You fit into me like a hook into an eye, a fish hook, an open eye. And perhaps my favorite short poem by Marion Moore, Poetry. I, too, dislike it. Reading it, however, with a perfect contempt for it, one discovers in it, after all, a place for the genuine. The Poetics of Wrongness can accept these poems, which have a remarkable ability to surprise and confuse and contradict in a small space. Moore's contempt isn't perfect, of course. It has a fault line in which the appeal of poetry slips through, and here she has made this neat little space for the genuine in her poem, in part by contradicting herself and the implied world and their dislike for poetry in the first line. But shortness as a goal, that I reject. I don't support Occam's razor or the law of parsimony. Poems are not problems to be solved with the fewest possible words. Length as a standard of measure for poetry is irrelevant. If it matters at all, I would say actually it's more difficult for short poems to fulfill a Poetics of Wrongness. See how well behaved those poems are that I just read you, how easily I can insert them into this lecture, how easily you can make that poetry sigh and move on. They are portable and easily memorizable. They are digestible and often feel pre-digested. And these are the good ones. Many short poems read to me as self-satisfied products of a mind that is condescending to me. The poet has chewed up the world and regurgitated it into my open beak. Get away from me, lyric poet of beauty and perfectness, with your it won't hurt a bit IV, through which you intend to painlessly insert the essence of something into my bloodstream. Give me instead food with all its fiber, a whole disgusting moving worm and a pile of pebbles. The Poetics of Wrongness prefers real foods, even if they make me sick, even when I have to chew and chew. The Poetics of Wrongness rejects a poetry that wants to be unobtrusive or invisible in its form. The Poetics of Wrongness doesn't want a chiseled jewel or a small purse of emotions recollected in tranquility. The Poetics of Wrongness wants the kind of poetry that, as Sylvia Plath said, at its best, can do you a lot of harm. Of course it can harm. The blood jet is poetry There is no stopping it, wrote Plath. I want instead Bernadette Mayer's unwieldy, book-length, 150-page-plus poem, Midwinter Day, that she supposedly, it is impossible, wrote all in one day, that travels from dreams to consciousness and back, that includes the voices of her children, the history of her town and sex, what she eats for lunch, gossip, lines in Shakespearean meter, prose, and common lists. The history of every historical thing, including God, but not including all men and women individually, is a violent mess like this ice. But for the spaces even hunchbacked history has allowed in between the famous and loud for something that's defined as what does please us, which is perhaps the story of an intimate family, though you won't believe or will be unable to love it, driven to research love's limits in its present solitude, as if each man or woman in the world was only one person with everything I've mentioned separate in him or she didn't represent history at all, though he or she had stories to tell and was just sitting kind of crazily before an open window in midwinter. Without this kind of longness and rushingness, how else can Bernadette Mayer begin to accurately describe the incoherence of the mind, of life, of being a woman, being alive? The poem is impossible and feels nearly unstoppable, and she does it successfully by including her awareness of the inherent failure of the project in the project. From dreams I made sentences, then what I've seen today, then past the past of afternoons of stories like memory, to seeing a plain introduction of modes of love and reason, then to end, I guess, with love, a method to this winter season. Instead of the Fabergé egg of a short lyric, I prefer the aesthetics of intractability and exhaustive exhaustedness, the physicality and ruptured rapture, the unapologetic plain-spokenness of James Schuyler's long lines too long to be in poems but are poems, too long for the page, too long to scan, too long to function as standalone lines, his tally of physical complaints, his observations about garbage trucks and air conditioners are anti-poetic and embraced and lauded by the Poetics of Wrongness. Or I want the book-length poem Tape for the Turn of the Year by A.R. Ammons, in which he typed and did not later edit a poem that begins and ends at the length determined by a 2¼ inch wide roll of adding machine paper that would end up being 200 pages long. Ammons loves and hates the roll of paper, adores and despises the project. The poem is so long, his back suffers. The project is so long, it's like a long marriage, and therefore provides him ample opportunity to be wrong, to change his mind, to find himself over and over. It is epic and anti-epic. Odysseus is a man trying to get home. Ammons is a man who almost never leaves home. He must continue the poem until the roll runs out. He is Penelope at her loom, but never unweaving, and it is the moments when Ammons grows exasperated, bored, exhausted, that he comes upon exquisite language making. Thank goodness he did not edit down this poem to crucial plot points or the greatest hits collection of best lines. It is the discursive, rambling journey of the poem and its many mistakes that is its glory. What do you get when you mix the pursuits of brevity and beauty? Advertising. The motto, the jingle, the political slogan, a pitch that should take no longer than a ride in an elevator. The Poetics of Wrongness prefers the stairs, prefers a half-finished, crumbling staircase to nowhere. The Poetics of Wrongness often can't fit in an elevator, wouldn't know which button to push, doesn't know where it's going, suffers from a fear of elevators, and has forgotten its keys and wallet. The Poetics of Wrongness wants poems that are expansive, inclusive, contradictory, self-conscious, ashamed, and irreverent. It's hard to be those things in 100 words or less. When one sees a painting by Jackson Pollock, one notices color and composition, of course, but the thrill of these paintings is the way in which the viewer sees a record of Pollock's body in motion, moving through time and space as he splattered paint or through it. All made works are records of an artist's time, but some are more visible in the recording of this time or in their preoccupation with time. Some art goes to great lengths to pretend that it emerged fully formed, like Athena from the leg of Zeus. But the Poetics of Wrongness is not interested in art made by the gods or by God, and gives no gold star for the illusion of effortlessness. You say it is boring to watch a person sit in a chair hour after hour, breathing in and out, taking breaks to eat and shit and make love and listen to the weather. You say this is not what art should be about or what art is for? The Poetics of Wrongness cares not for an absent God artist we can't see or hear, but wants the living miracle of a real person in a real place at a real time artist. The Poetics of Wrongness says that art is these moments of repetition and recurrence and realness, and that in the time it takes to read such a long poem, in the experiential recognition of how long it took to write such a poem, the poet becomes real. With frustration and boredom and anger and familiarity and adoration and gratitude, the writer and reader spend time together. The poem violating the laws of time and space, that is their meeting place. The place where they become visible to one another and begin to have a relationship that is both imaginary and real, full of faults and failure and desire. It is like sex, and it is what all art, long or short, aspires to. 4, poetry should be timeless. Speaking of time, the Poetics of Wrongness has a problem with timelessness. A journalist once said to me, journalism is important to a large number of people for a very short period of time, whereas poetry is important to very few people for potentially a long period of time. Okay, maybe, but this does not necessarily lead to the widely held idea that a good poem should be timeless. I've already said that being full of time, visibly, audibly, palpably full of time, can be an asset. And I know that timeless is not meant to imply without time, but most poems but the Poetics of Wrongness rejects timelessness and lastingness as an attribute and suggests timeliness as an alternative. The Poetics of Wrongness wants a poetry that is conscious of time, that is of a particular time, and that is relevant, all of which is closer to timeliness than timelessness. Some poems will last and continue to be relevant, but the Poetics of Wrongness wants a poem that is hard to capture and hard to hold. The Poetics of Wrongness wants a poem that will not last forever because it is a fresh, alive, unstable, and potentially, hopefully, useful at this moment now. Perhaps the poem is on its deathbed. The Poetics of Wrongness is not afraid of hospice. Everything alive dies. Everything fresh expires. The Poetics of Wrongness wants poems with a shelf life made of living ingredients. The Poetics of Wrongness would like artists to rethink the idea that the purpose of making art is to make something that will outlive and outlast our minor mortal lives. Rethink the goal of making something that will endure. Rethink the virtue of timelessness. Do you want to write a poem that will outlive you, that will last forever? Like plastic? Like toxic waste? 5, poetry should be universal. One of the great long poems of all time is Walt Whitman's Song of Myself. The Poetics of Wrongness embraces Whitman and his barbaric yawp, his multitudes, his, do I contradict myself? Very well, then I contradict myself. The relationality of the poem as it reaches out to the reader, its willingness to imagine its own demise, its insistence, its long-windedness. The Poetics of Wrongness loves Whitman's inclusiveness, his energy, his corporality, his unbounded ego and passion, but the Poetics of Wrongness rejects the way Whitman's love of everything has been used to espouse universality as a necessary quality in poems. Here are the first 3 lines of Song of Myself. I celebrate myself and sing myself, and what I assume, you shall assume, for every atom belonging to me as good belongs to you. Oh, the Poetics of Wrongness does wildly love this poem. But To say that Whitman's open arms poetics, his democratic attention, makes him a universal everyman writing for and to a universal everyman is a misunderstanding of Whitman, just as slantness as needless indirection is a misunderstanding of Dickinson. The Poetics of Wrongness is deeply suspect of universality. Let me stay instead with the specific, the particular, the peculiar, and the personal, even if it means that I am accused of narcissism. It is fine to look at myself if I am looking with attention and with scrutiny, and often it is not myself I gaze at in the still pool, but rather you, the other, and the world in all its wrongness. Even if your atoms and my atoms are remarkably similar, even if we are all made up of what everything in the cosmos is made up of, let me not assume I know you, or worse, that I am you. Poetry is a mirror which makes beautiful that which is distorted, wrote Percy Bysshe Shelley. The poetry of wrongness would like to describe the distorted and distortion without making it beautiful. Pain is filtered in a poem so that it becomes finally, in the end, pleasure, wrote Mark Strand. The Poetics of Wrongness would like a pain that stays pain, not because this is a poetics of sadomasochism, although the Poetics of Wrongness has no problem with sadomasochism, but because it is a poetics of what isness, not of what would be niceness. The Poetics of Wrongness rails against the way in which universalism or universality is often used as a way of excluding certain subject matters or tones or bodies from poetry, the way encouraging poets to write about common experiences that everyone has often has the opposite effect of leading to a poetry that is only about certain, usually male, usually white, usually heterosexual, usually normative experiences that, according to straight white men, are universal. The Poetics of Wrongness prefers, instead, to write with the parts of our brains and hearts and souls and emotions that are broken or disrupted, to write out of our fetishes and aphasias, the way Chuck Close, who is face blind, has spent a lifetime making portraits. The Poetics of Wrongness suggests that it is in the specific, honest portrayal of your most peculiar, obscene, and esoteric qualities that you will provoke empathy and identification. Here's Philip Roth, a writer full of wrongness in American Pastoral. You fight your superficiality, your shallowness, so as to try to come at people with without unreal expectations, without an overload of bias or hope or arrogance. You come at them unmenacingly and on your own 10 toes. Instead of tearing up the turf with your caterpillar treads, take them on with an open mind as equals, man to man, as we used to say, and yet you never fail to get them wrong. You might as well have the brain of a tank. You get them wrong before you meet them, while you're anticipating meeting them. You get them wrong while you're with them, and then you go home and tell someone else about the meeting, and you get them all wrong again. Since the same generally goes for them with you, the whole thing is really a dazzling illusion, empty of all perception, an astonishing farce of misinterpretation. And yet, what are we to do about this terribly significant business of other people, which gets bled of the significance we think it has and takes on instead a significance that is ludicrous? So ill-equipped are we all to envision one another's interior workings and invisible aims. Is everyone to go off and lock the door and sit secluded like the lonely writers do in a soundproof cell, summoning people out of words and then proposing that these word people are closer to the real thing than the real people that we mangle with our ignorance every day? The fact remains that getting people right is not what living is all about anyway. It's getting them wrong that is living, getting them wrong and wrong and wrong, and then, on careful reconsideration, getting them wrong again. That's how we know we're alive. We're wrong. Yes, I say, yes to that. The Poetics of Wrongness knows that summoning people out of words and mangling real people with and without words is always an act of getting them wrong, Our word people are no more or less wrong than real people, and as writers, we should try to be at least as alive and wrong in our writing as we are in our real lives. Even if we were able to rescue universality from its highly problematic history, its tendency to mean majority or mainstream when it says common or shared, even if we were able to appreciate the good-hearted social utopianism that motivates liberal notions of universality, I still reject it. The Poetics of Wrongness rejects the notion that poetry should have a restorative effect on the world. And the Poetics of Wrongness rejects the idea that presenting an idealized utopian view of the world will have a restorative effect on the individual or the collective. This vision of the artist as creating an act of tzimtzum, in which he or she finds the shattered pieces of the once perfect whole divine and gathers and restores them, is offensive to the Poetics of Wrongness. I believe there are shared feelings and qualities and experiences, but I do not believe that foregrounding these commonalities rather than our differences will lead to better poetry or will result in us treating each other less poorly. Writing out of the universal is often confused with writing for the everyman, which too often can become a kind of lowest common denominator poetics, which is deeply underestimating of the intelligence of every man, or a sort of total abstraction that renders everyone equally estranged from meaning and significance. Notions that we are all created equal, that women can do anything men can do, that really we're all the same, and other well-intentioned fantasies don't keep us from killing each other. We see difference, we act difference. Let us at least admit it and return to the peculiarity and particularity in a relational context, an I that is singular, but always reaching out to you and you and you. The I of the poetry of Alice Notley, who the Poetics of Wrongness does indeed worship. Here's the end of her long poem, The Prophet. Do not generally go about giving advice. That which is everybody's business is nobody's business. Let thyself become undeceived through the beauty and strangeness of the physical world. It is almost possible to believe that if you look at it, really see it, be it for yourself, you will be free. They say it will be cloudy tomorrow, but they are often wrong. There's a lot to say about 2 and 1. Your life is not small or mean. It is beautiful and big, full of planets, clouds, skies, and also your tiniest things of you. 1 is you, and all this, and 2, and yet you must never stop making jokes. You are not great, you are life. 6, poetry is close to godliness. The Poetics of Wrongness is anthropocentric. It is written by human beings for human beings and about human beings. It is interested in the divine and nature as seen and experienced through the human senses and intellect. In its preference for the literal, for the direct, for the domestic, for the political, for the relational, for the sociological, for the individual, and for the particular, it can be perceived as atheistic. This is not necessarily the case. The Poetics of Wrongness knows that ideology is a petri dish for wrongness. The Poetics of Wrongness is foundationally anti-fundamentalist, while recognizing, of course, that being anti-anything can develop easily into fundamentalism. The Poetics of Wrongness recognizes prayer as an ancient and enduring form of writing out of wrongness, both internal and external. The Poetics of Wrongness loves the impossibility of monotheism, but only for its impossibility, and for the ways in which it reveals the fragility and pathos and imagination and terror of humankind. The Poetics of Wrongness knows that whomever or whatever or however created the world, it wasn't by my own hand, and I have only the power to name and love and suffer and die. If the Poetics of Wrongness believes in any God, it is the God of human failure, a God imagined to make visible in us what is ungodly, that is, doubt, weakness, fallibility, fear, ineptitude, physicality, and mortality. The Poetics of Wrongness is interested in getting close to God, or beauty, or perfection, only insofar as the journey reveals the inherent and absolute failure of our inevitable reaching after. As Whitman said, "Why should I wish to see God better than this day? I see something of God each hour of the 24, and each moment then, in the faces of men and women, I see God, and in my own face in the glass. I find letters from God dropped in the street, and every one is signed by God's name. And I leave them where they are, for I know that wheresoever I go, others will punctually come forever and ever. Or they will not. Perhaps we will finally destroy the world. In which case, let us be thankful that we have made poetry and had poetry while we still had eyes to see." Final thoughts. It is by misunderstanding these poets and these ideas about poetry and feeling misunderstood by them that I have come to have the courage and energy to say anything at all. I have spent most of my life figuring out who I want to be by trying to figure out how to be unlike and like my mother. I watch my sons come into adulthood by wanting to do everything their own way, which arises out of their awareness of my wrongness, my insufficiency, which arises out of their awareness of who I am or who they think I am. My husband and I hurt each other as we struggle to see one another as separate but connected. Human babies are astonishingly dependent for an impossibly long period of time. It is remarkable how long it takes for them to perceive that they are not one with the universe, not one with the face that is hopefully staring back at them with love. Oppositionality is not an act of violence or hatred to the one opposed. Poetry, wrote Allen Ginsberg, is not an expression of the party line. It's that time of night, lying in bed, thinking what you really think, making the private world public. That's what the poet does. The Poetics of Wrongness agrees. Part of knowing what I think is knowing what I do not agree with and saying no to the party line. And making these private disagreements public, yes, that's what the poet does. So, what if there were no more party line? Would poetry cease to exist? Cease to be necessary? I say that such an age of agreement and sameness and rightness will never come to be, and that poetry will therefore always be necessary. I would love to be proven wrong. Thank you.
So Rachel's now going to take a few questions. Does anyone have any questions in the audience? There's one.
I write mostly short lyrics as far as poems, and I've always had difficulty sort of working with longer works. And I kind of disagree with you a little bit because I feel like all short lyrics have mistakes in them. And that's just part and parcel of being a poem and being a short poem. And there's a tradition of short lyrics of hundreds of years where they have the particular, from that tradition that they play off, where they have allusions and such like that. So I guess could you speak to the short lyric a little bit more, at least, with these comments in mind?
Sure. And first of all, obviously, I love it that you disagree with me. I am clearly, being provocative. I didn't say anything I don't believe, but I am speaking from a position of provocation and oppositionality. So yes, there are short poems that I dearly love. And that do, as you say, include contradiction and some of these other elements that I'm talking about when I'm imagining this Poetics of Wrongness. And I think one of the ways in which short poems can achieve that Poetics of Wrongness is by clearly not attempting to be complete, being aware of how small they are in the world, how little space they take up, I think brings attention to the fact that there's the rest of the world, which is problematic. I guess I feel protective and defensive of long poems insofar as they are often on the edge of what our acceptance of what a poem really should be or can be. As you say, there's a tremendously long tradition of the short lyric poem, and I think it's even difficult for us to imagine the way in which the lyric, or our understanding or definition of the lyric, is not necessarily the only way to imagine what poetry is. It's one particular way. Poetry, like what would you imagine would even be an unlyric or an anti-lyric poem? And the problem with the lyric as a kind of defining synonym for poetry is that it doesn't leave us room for poems to do a lot of other things, or for us to even recognize that poems do a lot of other things. The problem with this kind of expectation or inherent kind of priority for shortness or brevity in poetry is that it doesn't allow us to either write poems in forms that are just not going to, there's certain kinds of poems I don't think you can write in a short form. So it begins to exclude stories, ideas, perspectives, kinds of language, kinds of sounds, kinds of settings, kinds of conceptions of poetry. It excludes those rather than including them. There was a standardized test that one of my sons took, and it was something like, a poem, it's a poem because, and it was multiple choice, and the answer that was right was, it's short. I mean, obviously, poems don't have to be short. So I don't know, that was a very long response to a very good question.
Thank you.
I want to thank you for this thing. I'm not from the United States of America. I always have to say that, I'm from the Caribbean. I grew up in the Netherlands, but from the Caribbean. And I must say that the whole notion of poetry of wrongness and the fact that you're breaking a lot of rules and regulations or questioning a lot of the fundamentals that have always been part of Western poetics, right? Speaks to me in a tremendous way coming from the Caribbean, where Caribbean poets, African poets, minority poets, if anything, basically to a certain extent part of this poetry of wrongness. Right?
Yeah.
They are very much, they had a poetry of wrongness before the poetry of wrongness, right?
Yeah.
But, the problem we face where I come from, right, in the Caribbean, I do not come from the worst part of the Caribbean, right? I come from the so-called French Dutch Caribbean. Is the fact that if you were to give this lecture there, I think there would be tremendous resistance about this lecture in Africa, because people would say just a minute, there's a lot of wrongness here, right? There's a lot of badness here, there's a lot of brokenness here, there's a lot of alienation, et cetera, what you're calling for. That your ability to hear the Library of Congress give a talk about the poetry of wrongness, right? Is a part of the luxury of the United States of America, right? That you can get this poetry, that you can get this talk about the poetry of wrongness, right? While if you come from other parts of the world, writers are, to a certain extent, being encouraged to come up with alternative and better visions, right? More complete visions, right? Not necessarily universal, etc., but visions that give some people something to look forward to, so some hope to escape where they are at. So, how would you feel about these things?
That is a totally fabulous, and I'm not going to be able to answer that properly right now. I'm going to try. But I mean, one of the things that's good about being a writer is you have a lot of time to write and then erase and then write and then erase. Like, I think it's going to really think through that question and respond intelligently would take me a lot of pages. But I think, surely it is also an important job of art and literature to imagine a utopian world, or to convince, I don't know. I'm going to stick with the Poetics of Wrongness. I think that if here's one way of thinking about this. Imagining a poetics of rightness. Okay, so maybe it will be helpful with a specific example. When I became a mother, I realized that my experience in childbirth and my experience of having young children was not an experience that I had seen written about in ways that in any way matched my own. It was most of the poems, and I since have found more. It wasn't that they didn't exist at all, but there were so few of them, and they were not the poems that were given to me in school. They were sentimental. They were idealized. They presented a version or a vision of motherhood and wifehood and femaleness that was so antithetical to what it felt like to me that it had the result of making me feel that there was something terribly wrong with me or with my children or with the way that I was going through life. And so in that sense, reading a poem that maybe was, my beautiful child, everything is perfect and wonderful and nothing is wrong with this picture, did not have the effect on me of somehow making me want to be more like that. It made me feel disengaged and dehumanized in a way. Whereas finding poems, as I later did, and also writing poems about the boringness and tediousness and physicality and awfulness as being part of the wonderfulness of motherhood or of birth, gave me a way to be in those experiences in a more human way and hopefully be better at those experiences. So that's a really small and really personal and domestic example that hopefully is relevant in some way. I do think that there's something really important that I haven't explored at all in this talk so far about the Americanness of what I'm talking about and the ways in which these thoughts are very much a product of having read almost only American poetry from a certain time period. I think that's a huge limitation on my thinking and on this talk. So that's a very incomplete response. But I appreciate the question. I think it's something that is like a big blinking cursor on the screen for me. Like, start here and think about that. Thank you. Hi.
My question to you is one of discussion of publication. So a lot of poetry is coming up with ideas, maybe before other people do, and taking advantage of that, your brain, and your existence. So I'm curious your thoughts on what's palatable in society, because we watch a lot of, reality television. We like to see people's lives excavated, exposed, a lot of humiliation in this culture, and as a result, a lot of exploitation. So when it comes to poetry and being real, where do we know when we're crossing the line, either as people looking for material or looking to, get something published, and looking for, that acceptance?
A few things. First of all, I'm really interested in this question of exploitation in poetry. And there's a really fabulous talk by Roger Reeves, which you can find I think it was in Chicago. If you Google Roger Reeves and poetry in the age of Ferguson, he has a talk in which he basically says that this practice of posting and reposting YouTube videos on Facebook and in a way of showing that you're a good person and that you feel outrage over these terrible events actually has the result of reenacting violence. And And I've been thinking about that a lot, about the ways in which, okay, so if if a poetry of wrongness, or any poetry, in part can function as a poetry of witness, can write about the things in the world that are wrong with the poet, that are wrong with others, that are wrong with the world. How does it do that without reenacting violence? How does it do that in a way that provokes empathy, that is a reaching out to another, but without provoking a kind of empathy that's a really easy response that actually leads to inaction, greater inaction, than if empathy had not been provoked at all. And Alexander Hemon also has a long piece about this, about the tendency of a certain kind of reader to, let's say, if you've read the book A Fine Balance, you read A Fine Balance. It's this long book about the history of India, and then you're like, oh, so terrible. Now I understand, or now I don't know what, and you close the book and you go on with your life, and you're very safe. It's a privileged position, and Hemon is actually saying, I'm sick of this way that we think of literature as provoking this kind of empathetic response as a good quality and as the end of the story. So how do you go into these difficult, complicated, problematic areas, either in your own history or in other people's history, without, first of all, exploiting the stories of others, or reenacting violence, or acting kind of as the end of the story? And you asked about publication specifically. I think that I have no idea what the answer to this question is. All of the lectures that I've been working on in some ways deal with this question of what are the ethical considerations about writing about real people. Siri would like to talk to me. I don't know why. Writing about other people or yourself in ways that are ethical. And I don't have an answer to that. And in some ways, the Poetics of Wrongness and writing this lecture was the only way I knew how to start writing anything at all, because I'd come to a place where making a mistake and saying the wrong thing and being wrong felt so terrible and so, unforgivable that I had to stop writing. And so it was only really, I think, by kind of imagining the job of the writer to be wrong and to stay in that wrongness and to not figure it out and to not find. I don't think there is a right answer, or I haven't found it yet. So I'm hoping that just acknowledging your own complicity is the closest you can get to being okay, or to having the permission to keep writing, I think, and publishing.
There needs to be an inherent wrongness to the pursuit and to the expression of what?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that the idea of revision as making something right or fixing something that's wrong is upside down. And I would suggest a revision of wrongness. I think that a revision is I'm not espousing or holding up poems that never have revision as better. No. I mean, I revise endlessly, as do almost all the poets that I know and love. But I think that trying to revise towards accuracy or authenticity, but again, not as a fixing necessarily. So, this is a metaphor I use. My poor student here has probably heard it a million times. But so I live in Manhattan, and I have an apartment with wood floors, and anyone who knows who has that, like after a while, the nails start to stick up, right? And then it's really annoying. You're walking, and then you rip your sock, or you hurt your foot, and you're like, ugh, this nail's sticking up. So you go, eventually when it gets too annoying, and then you get a hammer and you nail it down, right? And I think that a lot of types of revision are kind of in that mode, like, oh, something's sticking out of the poem, something's bothering me, it's tearing my sock, it's hurting my foot, I'm just gonna nail it down so that I don't see that nail, so that it's a smooth surface, so I'm not tripping over anything. But if you think about another related metaphor of an anthropologist excavating a site, you're looking for the thing that's sticking up. You're looking for the thing because that's where you're going to go deep. That's where you're going to excavate, for signs of life or for remnants that's going to give you information. So I think, rethinking what it would mean to make a poem better, instead of fixing something that's wrong or hammering down the nail, but thinking about, what is the heart of this poem, or what is the place that's most wrong in this poem, or that bothers me every time I read it, and maybe thinking about, well, where to go deeper there, what to excavate there. Not to leave the nail up. I'm not saying just leave all your nails up and, rip up the bottoms of your feet, but how can you think about other ways of improving poems? I mean, all our language is even inherently geared towards rightness and perfection and smoothness, and so it's hard for me to even kind of use the language in this way that would imply a different relationship to making something better, but without making it less wrong. If that makes any sense.
Well, with that, we'll have to close. So if everyone can join me in giving Rachel Zucker a big round.
Thank you.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.